Hello and welcome to Black Power Women, the second event in the Radical Black Women series launched by Lawrence Wishart in partnership with the Black Cultural Archives. My name is Jemana, I'm the books editor at Lawrence Wishart and I'm the creator of this series. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce the series and today's panelists as well as the moderator. The Radical Black Women series is a new book series that seeks to spotlight the contributions of Black women to social justice movements in Britain. It was born out of a desire to redress, if even in a small way, the lack of resources that are available on Black British history in general and Black women's history in particular. The first book in the series is a new edition of Claudia Jones' A Life in Exile by Marika Sherwood, with a new preface by Black feminist researcher Lola Olufemi. We're offering attendees of this event 25% off the book with the discount code Claudia Launch Event, which will be valid until the 10th of October. We'll put the code up on the screen a couple of times during the event, and make sure you head over to lwbooks.co.uk to get your copy. With that said, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's event, Varaidzo. Varaidzo is a writer, editor, and artist. She is the digital marketing, communications, and content producer at Open Eye Gallery, and was previously the digital editor at Wasafari and arts and culture editor at Galdem. Her essays and articles have been featured in The Guardian, New Statesman, and Dazed. In her personal work, she has a particular interest in documenting the stories of the African diaspora in the digital age using film, art, audio, and fiction. Thanks so much for agreeing to host this discussion. How are you doing today? You are muted.
Always, there's always one. I would say thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be part of this discussion.
Amazing. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited about today. I'll introduce the other panelists and then I'll leave you guys to have the discussion. So A.S Francis is a PhD candidate at the University of Chichester and coordinator of the Young Historians Project. Amelia's research concerns Black women's involvement in Britain's Black radical movement of the late 20th century and the development of the intertwined Black women's movement. Welcome, Amelia.
Hi, thanks. Good to see you both.
Amazing. Thanks for being here. And our next panelist is Zainab Abbas. Zainab was International Secretary for the Black Liberation Front, a leading protagonist for women's rights and social change in Britain. Zainab was also a member of the Brixton Black Women's Group, a foundational Black feminist organisation in Britain. Welcome, Zainab. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion. Varaidzo, take it away.
Brilliant. Well, it's lovely to have you both here. And tonight's discussion specifically is titled Black Power Women and sits in the context of the Radical Black Women series. So I think to start off and to introduce you both a bit further, I think it would be really nice if you could highlight some of your personal experiences and expertise and research that you might attach to the term Black Power Women. So I think, Amelia, if we start with you and your PhD work, that might be a nice opener.
Okay, sure. I've been researching the various Black radical histories pertaining to Britain for a few years now, and I've in the midst of my PhD research at the moment, which is an overview of Black women activists who were around in Britain, active in various organisations that might be categorised as Black radical organisations from the period of 1965 to 1985. And I guess I have a particular interest in one activist, Gerlin Bean, who I think Zainab can also speak more about from a personal perspective as well. So I'm also in the midst of writing what will be a book in this series on Black radical women, which will be published by Lawrence and Wishart on Gerlin Bean as well.
And it sounds like Gerlin Bean will come up again in this discussion. So I'm going to park that there and we'll come back to that work. And Zainab, go to you and pose the same question to you: is how would you attach your personal experiences, expertise and research to the term Black Power Women?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a researcher. You know, academically, I don't even have the qualifications. What I'm talking about is my own personal experience, being part of the Black Liberation Front and the Brixton Black Women's Group. And there was a group of sisters which were very much in the forefront of the Black movement in this country. You won't always hear their names, but, you know, they were feisty women. There was a lot of us, and we often got together on various events or for various reasons. And we were often part of different organizations. So there's a lot of history there, and I'm disappointed a lot of Black women from my era are not coming forward to document their history. It's really sad for me to see that. And I'm not quite sure why that is. There's nothing to refute in anything they say or do, because each had their own history and each had their own story to tell. But I hope tonight I can name a few and tell you about their part in the movement and you know, their contribution to the Black struggle in this country.
Definitely, and I think those contributions are really important to highlight, and there'll be time later on in the event to look at the differences and how organizing was happening in the 70s and 80s, and how it's been different now, and how certain histories have been very well documented and certain histories haven't at all. But I think to stay sort of in the past and look at the work that you were doing specifically, Zainab, I'm really interested in the work that you were doing around organizing supplementary schools to help young Black children get better education. And I wonder if you can paint a scene of the landscape of what it was like for Black children generally, and why and how you undertook that work specifically.
Well, I think we all based our activism around that on personal experience. You know, unlike a lot of my contemporaries, I was born in this country in 1950. So I went through the school system from very early on, you know, till 18. And my school life was horrendous. There was nothing happy about it. There was nothing that I can actually say pleased me about it. The area I grew up in, I've never been back to since 1967, 68, and I never want to go back to it. And there was nothing that kind of informed what we were doing in the Black community. And also, you know, the impact of Bernard Cord's book, you know, how the miseducation of Black people and how they were labeling young Black children, you know, basically as retards, you know, because they spoke with a Jamaican accent or a Trini accent or, you know, a Barbadian accent. And so the supplementary schools were born. When I was in Birmingham, we ran a supplementary school every Saturday in Birmingham. And I would teach math and other people would teach history. It was very interesting that history was a major topic, because in those days we didn't have Black figures to look up to. So it was very important to teach history. And of course it tended to be African history, because people were concerned about where we came from. And it was interesting for me because people's view of Egypt was that pharaonic Egypt was a white culture. It was a Greek culture, when in actual fact it was a Nubian culture and very much an African culture. So teaching those things was very important, but also basic education, numeracy, literacy, that was very important. A lot of our people came here very uneducated, or those that were educated were part of the Black movement because, you know, they offered support where they could. So literacy was very important and numeracy was very important. And that's where the supplementary schools came about. And our kids were doing well in them. When they were surrounded by Black faces who were teaching them stuff, they did very well. They didn't misbehave. They were very disciplined and they would learn. So,
and I think it's that really paints a picture of the landscape of what it was like then. And I'm really interested to later on also look at the same kind of need and desire that we have now to teach still about Black British history. And I think if we stay in the 70s and 80s for a bit, and Amelia, if you bring in some of your research as well, I'm really interested in actually what was the socio-political landscape for Black women at that time. And did they have a socio-political identity in the same way as they do now? Or has there been a shift that you've noticed?
me, are you talking to me or Amelia?
Well, I'm posing the question to both of you, but I think maybe Amelia, if we start with you and kind of what your specific research has uncovered, and then we can go to Zainab and your experience of it.
Okay, sure. Well, I think we're beginning in around the 70s, is that right?
Yeah, so 70s to 80s.
Okay, sure. So obviously by 1970 in Britain, you have the emergence of this new kind of phase of Black radical politics in Britain, which is the Black Power movement, which is largely inspired by all kinds of different things going on globally, including the US Black Power movement, decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean, and of course, maybe most importantly, as Zainab has touched upon, the experiences of racism that young people were going through on a daily basis in Britain, and all of that culminates in the emergence of a Black Power movement. And then, of course, you have different organizations in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Liverpool, all of these major cities, something is going on. And it's a really vibrant time for young Black people in Britain. And there are certain type of politics that are invigorating young people and providing them with optimism and hope, particularly just because the nature of capitalism. Obviously, the Black Power movement has a strong anti-capitalist and socialist stance. All of these different organizations have slightly different ideologies, but all informed by anti-capitalism and socialism. And then in terms of women, as I'm sure Zainab will expand upon, just using her own personal experience, women, just as much as men, were a really integral part of this movement and played leading roles in it, even though it often goes unacknowledged, particularly in written history. So the most obvious example is maybe Althea Jones-LeCointe, who, those of us who watched Steve McQueen's series and other documentaries around Black Power know that she was the leading member in the Black Panthers in London. Other women like Kath Locke up in Manchester, who was leading the Black Unity and Freedom Party chapter that they had set up there. And other women as well, like Zainab, who's a leading member of the Black Liberation Front at this time. So I think that it's something of a misconception that I don't know really. I can't speak upon why it's happened, but certainly a misconception that women were underrepresented in these kind of organizations at the time. And as Zainab will tell you, they played a really leading and important role, not only in fighting for the positions of Black people in Britain, but also supporting the struggles that are going on elsewhere in their homelands, whether that's in the Caribbean or Africa, and linking up with other similar anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles taking place all over the world. And then, as well as doing all of that work, always making sure that conversations around the particular issues that Black women, as Black people and women, were facing, were constantly on the agenda in these organizations as well.
And Zainab, does that resonate for you? How would you describe the social political landscape for Black women in the 70s and onto the 80s?
It's very interesting the way people research about us, I've noticed, because we were living something. We didn't say, oh, let's do this. It just happened because we faced a certain situation. I'm sure it's the same nowadays, and I'm sure that's how people become involved. They face a certain situation and then they participate. So we didn't consider ourselves as special. We just got on with it. It was very important to be part of the Black movement for me. Being isolated as an individual Black person or an individual Black family just didn't wash. You know, the isolation was the killer. The most important thing was to be part of something. And the Black Power movement was very, very significant. And, you know, we were informed by what was going on in the States and influenced, but, you know, let's not deny the influence of what was going on in the States. The civil rights movement, watching our people being, you know, killed and murdered. And I remember being deeply affected by the funeral of Medgar Evers, you know, and it just brought out all my frustration as a young teenager and seeing, you know, what they'd done to his family and where we were in this country, because we were despised. You can't imagine going down the street now today in London and being spat at, being abused on every corner, people following you around shouting, Enoch, Enoch, Enoch. Even the major contemporary pop music and songs, you know, what's the guitarist's name, that famous guitarist? He goes on stage and mentions, you know, I support Enoch, Eric Clapton.
Cream.
I mean, just imagine that, you know, people that you as a young person want to look up to, you know, I love his music, because of course all their music came from Black people anyway, you know. The music they were playing had origins in, you know, Black culture. But no, he doesn't recognize that. He goes on stage and shouts, Enoch, Enoch, Enoch. Now, today he might say, look, I was drunk and that was nothing. Well, I'm tired of you people telling me it was nothing. That impacted me. That had an enormous impact on my life. And I remember when, you know, after Enoch Powell, years later, they tried to clean up his reputation, you know, after the so-called Rivers of Blood speech, you know, because it's you have to put it in quotes because it actually wasn't him saying Rivers of Blood. But that speech seriously impacted my life again. And all Black teenagers throughout Britain at that time, and Black families, and Black women working out there, and Black men, you know, seriously impacted us. And I'm sorry, I don't care that you're trying to clean up your reputation. Your reputation is shite, and deservedly so. Oh, am I not supposed to say words like shite?
If we could try and hold back, but you know, you said it, and I think that's a really sobering and very clear description of the situation that you were saying that your work was a direct response to. And I'm also really interested in you saying that the important thing was to be part of a group and to acknowledge that you were in a conjoined situation and bonding with people that were also part of that situation and on the receiving end of that experience. And I'm particularly interested in those groups such as the Black Unity and Freedom Party and the Brixton Women's Group, and really how those groups were formed and what they were formed in response to, and then particularly their aims and practices of those groups too. So, Amelia, I know that you've studied these groups as well, but Zainab, if we start with you and your experience of being part of groups, forming those groups, and what your aims and practices were.
Well, when I was in Birmingham in the very early 70s, I was part of the Birmingham campus, and that was very comfortable for me. And Birmingham is a very gutsy place, and you know, there was a very clear ghetto area. called Handsworth, and it was a comfortable place for me to be, and I felt I fitted in there quite nicely. When I came down to London, there were a number of options. There was like the Panthers of Althea and people like that, and the Black Liberation Front. Well, the BLF's philosophy fit with mine, very much so, because I've said this many a time, and I'll always say it because it's what is important to me as a human being. It was never about color. In other words, I didn't join a movement to stand up and say, like me, even though my skin is brown. That's not what it was about. It was about struggle. It was about fighting for a change in the system. And the biggest inspiration for all of us then was the Viet Cong. Because Vietnam was a massive war involving the American might and technologically advanced military machine dropping more bombs in one day on Vietnam than the whole of the Second World War. And these Viet Cong defeating them. They defeated the most technologically advanced army in the world.
So how was this related to the work that you were doing and how
well,
you
it inspired us. It inspired us to believe that this struggle was for all of us. So, and then you got Layla Khalid, blowing up the TWA plane. Nobody was on board, by the way. It was on the tarmac in Jordan. But people like Layla Khalid inspired us. The Palestinians inspired us. The African liberation movements, each one inspired us. And that's what it was about. It was about an anti-capitalist movement for justice and liberation. It wasn't just about the color of our skin. And it actually denigrates us to think it was just about the color of our skin.
So I think that's a really interesting parallel that we'll touch on a bit later in the talk about how history remembers things and how your perspective of being part of those movements differs from maybe how those movements are being remembered and recognized and archived. And also just the sort of the way that people organizing and creating movements today might see it differently and are more sort of race focused in their approach. But we'll come back to this because I still want to focus on this time. Amelia, I want to ask your opinion on some of those organizing groups and what you've uncovered in your research. And then after that, I think it would be a really good opportunity to bring in Gerlin Bean and that work. So yeah, Amelia, if you can first just talk about your understanding of groups that were operating in the 70s and 80s and your opinions on those.
Okay, sure. I think, well, there are so many that come to mind. I'm trying to filter my thoughts. I think that, as I mentioned in the beginning, all of these organizations which are operating in the same network and communicating with each other have a lot of similar ideas, and at the end of the day, fighting for the same goals that Zainab outlined, being justice and liberation, and also in many cases for these organizations, socialist revolution, whatever that might look like. I think that you have, going back into the late 1960s, the United Coloured People's Association, or the UCPA, which to us in the 21st century sounds like a bit of an odd name for a Black Power organization, but at that time, that's what it was. It was a Black Power organization. And then because of all of these different ideas and kind of differing politics of the members, you have a splintering, which creates a really dynamic and diverse network of organizations. So you have the emergence of the Black Unity and Freedom Party in 1970, which is informed a lot by the Cuban Revolution and the things that were achieved in Cuba by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And they also are really inspired by the Chinese model of communism as well. I think the Black Unity and Freedom Party has been really interesting for me in that since its creation in 1970, it always paid really particular attention to making sure that the voices of women were highlighted, whether it was through its newsletter that it carried, which was Black Voice, or convening conferences on the issues of Black people and making sure that Black women were represented. So it's not surprising that only several years later you have the emergence of a Black women's movement, first initiated by the Brixton Black Women's Group, of which Gerlin Bean is a member, and she was actually a former member of the Black Unity and Freedom Party, as well as the Black Liberation Front. The Black Liberation Front is really interesting as well because, as Zainab's touched upon, it also has this Pan-African nature to it, which maybe other organizations didn't highlight as much in its work. So the Black Liberation Front gave immense support to the liberation struggles that were taking place on the continent of Africa, even though, as Zainab might touch upon, the members of the Black Liberation Front were not necessarily, they weren't rich people, had their own kind of economic struggles going on, and were still able to commit themselves to raising funds or doing whatever it was that they could to contribute to the struggles taking place in Africa. And then, so from around 1973, you have the beginnings of, or kind of sowing the seeds of an autonomous Black women's organization, in which a lot of these women who are active in the Black Power movement beforehand are able to carve out spaces for themselves in this movement to advance these conversations about women's issues, which are already happening, but might require more space in order for women to find their particular political voice.
Brilliant. And like you said, Gerlin Bean, I'm really interested in women in these particular movements. The panel is called Black Power Women. And I know that this is someone that you both are really excited to talk about and want to kind of share, Amelia, the work that you've done, and Zainab, your thoughts as well about why perhaps more people don't understand or have heard of the work of Gerlin Bean. But I'm going to take it away with both of you. So I think, Zainab, if we start with you, and you share a bit about, you know, the thoughts you wanted to share about Gerlin Bean.
Well, Gerlin, as Amelia knows, is a very dear, close friend of mine. And her family is very close to me to this day. The reason I'm cross about this situation is that at that period in our lives, Gerlin was that much older than us. She was 11 years old. So I'm 71, she's 82 now. And she was that much older than us and had been around the feminist movement, the white feminist movement, you know, finding out what they were talking about and what they were dealing with. And in a way, because she was that much older than us, she mentored us. So I was living with Olive Morris and Liz Turnbull, as she was then, but she's OB now, in Relton Road in Brixton. And Gerlin,
it's worth pausing here for just a second, just to explain on who Olive Morris and Liv Turnbull are, just for the audience members that don't know all of these names, because we're going to come back to the work of Gerlin, but I think when we're talking about the women, it's really important that we actually state explicitly who we are talking about.
Well, Olive and Liz were both Panthers, and I want to mention other women too, because there was a lot of speakers around there that nobody is talking about, which I'm amazed at. I'm amazed because they were Panthers. I was not a Panther. I was in the Black Liberation Front. Gerlin was in the Black Liberation Front, but Gerlin was a mentor to all of us down in Brixton because she was running the Gresham Project. And as I said, she had this feminist background, and she would be there for the sisters around. Olive Morris was very much in the squatters movement, but she was a panther first and foremost. She wasn't just squatting people all the time, but and nor was Liz. Liz was a panther too, you know, along with Barbara Bees. I want you to remember who Barbara is. Barbara was one of the Mangrove Nine. And the reason I want you to remember Barbara is Barbara at the time had a small child. Now, if you can imagine her going to trial at the Old Bailey, and what if she'd gone down? What would happen to her child? Do you see what I mean? See the pressures that being in the movement you were under. And people don't recognize that about Barbara, but Barbara Bees was very much around at that time. Layla Hassan was around at that time. I knew her less so than Barbara and Olive and Liz. There was a lot of sisters just there and very much part of the movement. They were always there organizing. Writing, I wrote in Grassroots about women. I interviewed Kathleen Cleaver and in Paris, and Eldridge Cleaver, and started a 50-odd year friendship, which is still going on to this day. And she was the information minister, the communication secretary of the Black Panther Party. And she put us in touch with lots of brothers and sisters from the movement over in the United States. Later on, after I'd seen Stokely Carmichael at the Roundhouse, I also met him in Washington, D.C. And again, all these interconnections we made in the movement among sisters and brothers. But in London, never mind in Birmingham too, because there's lots of sisters working in Birmingham too. In London, there was a load of the sisters, and Althea is the most well-known because she defended herself at the Mangrove, but Althea was important too because she was this brilliant speaker, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She was mesmerizing, who came out very much, shone through as a leader of the Black Power movement. So we weren't shrinking violets in the background of the various organizations we belonged to. We were very much in the forefront. And I really would recommend, and Amelia, you know what I feel about this, but I want you girls to go out there and meet all these sisters and talk to them, because it's amazed me that they are keeping their voices silent, even to this day. And I don't know why. I don't know why. We were proud. I'm certainly proud of my period, my time in the Black movement in this country. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Sure, we made mistakes. We all made mistakes, but who doesn't make mistakes? But it doesn't matter. I was very happy to be part of that movement. And
I think that would be a really good point, actually, to bring in Amelia's work and ask Amelia where your particular interest in Gerlin did actually come from, and your process in researching Gerlin's life and where you are now with that.
I can see Zainab smiling because it's actually rooted in a conversation that I had with Zainab, probably the first time I met you. So Zainab and I actually met at the launch of a project which I was working on with the Young Historians Project, which was a documentary and an exhibition about the history of the Black Liberation Front. And it was really sad that during the production or the filming of this documentary, we didn't get a chance to interview Zainab, so she doesn't appear in the documentary. We were really sad that we didn't get to interview more women. But Zainab came along to this launch event and she spoke about her time in the BLF, and we were really grateful to hear about it. And then from that moment, me and Zainab just hit the ground running, and have had a really great relationship since. But Zainab has been really integral because she's like the historian's dream, as in she's someone who I've interviewed about her experiences in the movement. She's also opened up my perspective on the ins and outs of the movement, and all of these various women who, as Zainab says, may have not told their story yet in full, but are definitely worth tracking down and convincing to talk to. So I think one of the first conversations I ever had with Zainab was, I was writing my undergraduate dissertation at the time, which was about women in the Black Liberation Front. And she said, you must include Gerlin. She is, quote, the most underrepresented sister in the entire movement. And I thought that was a really powerful way of describing someone as the most underrepresented, but so completely important to getting a full sense, belittled, getting a full sense of the history. So Gerlin Bean is mentioned in various different writings and history projects about the Black Power movement and the Black women's movement. But she is mentioned a lot of the time in passing or in relation to maybe other more prominent or better remembered activists, like the late Olive Morris, for example, who was much more well remembered than her comrades. So Gerlin Bean, I think, is really important because when I interview women who were members of many different organizations that had all kinds of different methods of in their activism, so many women and men, for that matter, cite Gerlin Bean as someone who was an instigator in their organization in some way, or first convinced them to participate in activism, or was a mentor to them as an elder. So she was slightly older than a lot of the other activists who were around at that time. So I kind of think of Gerlin as someone who might have been under-acknowledged because she was someone who was so consistent and present throughout, that it might be the fact that she's so obvious to people's minds, and she's, for that reason, been taken for granted. But it is essential to repair the damage that has been done, because it has been damage, I think, to the overall narrative of this period of Black women's activism. So one method of doing that is talking to women like Zainab and others who had a relationship with Gerlin at this time and were particularly inspired by what she was doing.
And I think this is a really good segue into actually looking more towards the current landscape of things. And I feel my personal feelings, this could also be because I am ignorant on a lot of things in the world, but my personal feelings is that there was definitely a sort of time during the turn of the century when a lot of these narratives got lost, and a lot of these groups also dissolved. And I'm wondering what your perspectives, both Amelia as someone who looks at the time period between the 60s and the 80s, and Zainab in your sort of your work and your lived experience, if you could sort of explain what happened to those groups and what your thoughts are about why some of these histories haven't been remembered in the way that you think that they should have been, if there isn't a clear explanation for that, or maybe there isn't.
I think there is an explanation for that. And I think it's the nature of Britain, you know. Even if you didn't agree with people in the United States, you know, I compare us because we're very similar diasporas. We are a much smaller community, of course, than African-American community in the US, but similar experiences. Britain is insidious in its racism. It's very subtle. It's not, we're going to shoot you, you know, we're going to kill you if we can, you know, if we get you on your own in prison, or we arrest you and for nothing, or we assault you for selling the newspaper, and I mean sexually assault you like we were in Birmingham and things like that. It's insidious. And then they don't acknowledge it. There was a whole period in history where the state was kept us under surveillance. They called the BLF the most dangerous organization in Britain. And mainly because, and I stress this, I think because of our international links, which other organizations didn't have as strong as we had at that moment in history. And that's why they considered us dangerous. But I think Brittany's just clever at putting down its own Black people. I want to ask you this. I pose a question to both of you. Imagine if you'd set up the first Black-owned, Black-run PR company in Britain, in America. Imagine that in America. You would have been lauded in the annals of history. You would have been, oh, wow, this person did this. The first Black person to do this, the first Black person to do that. I did that in Britain. I set up the first Black-owned PR and public affairs company. Have you ever heard of it? No.
Not me personally.
The reason you'll never hear about it is because they do everything to dissipate what we achieved. And then most of the time they try to stop us achieving. Do you see what I mean? See, racism here is nasty. It's actually nasty. It's subtle, but it's worse because of that. It stab you little pricks all over your body rather than a knife in your back. I'd much rather have the knife in my back than the constant little cuts, death by 1,000 cuts. And that's what they do in this country. They have no respect for us. They actually don't think we should be here, even now. Remember, I was born here, so 71 years of age, and I was born here. Were you born here? Were you born here, Amelia? All of these people that came after me have been born here, but do they see us as part of British society? I actually don't think they do, and I don't think it's any better today for you young people than it was for me.
And I also think that in the sort of keeping Black people, keeping any sort of ethnic minority as a foreigner, it really helps that process of erasing these histories, because sort of the consensus is that we're all a brand new thing. Obviously, we all know that that's not the case at all. Amelia, I'm wondering if you could jump in on that question as well, of like what your experience in your research has been, and then also trying to do that research now of highlighting these histories and why it hasn't been done in necessarily a successful way yet, or how can we be more successful in our aims to make sure these histories continue being told?
I think that I certainly agree with Zainab that this erasure of a historical memory is incredibly purposeful. I think in the context of schooling, if at school you're taught is that there was this guy called Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, but they were in America, nothing really happened here, then that's going to shape your understanding of the history of activism in Britain. And I think that I was a minority in a lot of ways, in that by the time I got to the age, university age, I chose to study history for the particular reason that I wanted to know more about this history that I hadn't been given a chance to learn about previously. But I think that for a lot of people, especially people of African and Caribbean descent, by the time you get to 18 years old, you're so traumatized by the fact that you have been erased from your history class, your ancestors have been erased or misremembered, that you don't want to touch the subject of history. And so that shows in the rates of young Black people who take up history as an undergraduate subject. So just briefly mentioning the work that the Young Historians Project does, it was set up for the reason that history as a subject at university is the third most unpopular subject for young Black people in Britain. It's not because Black people don't enjoy learning about history, it's that we've been so missed out of it, of the curriculum and the mainstream conversations of history in this country, that it's like at this point you'd feel like it has no relevance to you and your personal experience, and that affects how we view ourselves as young people of African and Caribbean descent in Britain, and also how we approach activism as well. So I think certainly just thinking about what's been going on recently in the last several years with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, something that I've noticed is that there is this missing piece to this contemporary activism, which is a coherent understanding of the movements that have gone before, including the Black Power movement in Britain, for example. And it is with this knowledge of what were the particular politics of this movement, what were the methods that activists like Zainab and Gerlin and others were using at this time, what challenges did they face, what successes did they have. It is with having an understanding of that history that we will be better prepared as young people of African and Caribbean descent to take on these challenges, which, as Zainab has mentioned, are ever present.
Brilliant. And I think it's really nice that you brought up the Young Historians Project, because something that really interests me talking to both of you is looking at how you have both worked on projects that are actually trying to teach Black history, but with a significant gap of history taking place in between those times. And Amelia, I'm particularly interested in how you find that young people are receptive to the radical work of Black people and Black women from Black British history. How receptive and aware are they? Is this a new thing to them? Is it something that you're just building upon knowledge they already have? What is the landscape of the Black British history that you're teaching currently?
Well, I think that perhaps people who are a similar age to me, so maybe early 20s, have this common experience of not being given access to this history on this previous period of Black radical activism in Britain. But that's definitely changed in the last several years, and it has a lot to do with the efforts of historians and teachers and activists at the moment who are finding really creative ways of presenting these histories. So making sure that young people know that it doesn't necessarily need to be contained in your school textbook for you to be able to access it. You can produce a documentary, a video, a podcast, which explores these kinds of histories. And it is actually by enabling young people to be historians themselves, or just someone with a microphone and a camera and interviewing your elders, you're enabling them to be able to play a really important role in making sure these histories are recorded further. So I would say that it's changed immensely in the last several years. There's still a long way to go. It's kind of like if you have a 1,000-piece puzzle, and you've got like 50 pieces in the puzzle so far, you're still trying to scramble to pull these pieces together and see the full picture of what this, I'm talking specifically about the Black Power movement, what it actually consisted of. So I think that initiatives like the Young Historians Project, a lot of the work that is done by the Black Culture Archives, History Matters, all of these different groups, which are concerned with making sure that these kinds of histories are more accessible to young people and people of any age. It's really inspiring, and it's changing the way that we understand this history in a positive way.
I think one of the, can I jump in here?
Yeah, no, go on, please do.
I think it's very important that you explain to my contemporaries the importance of this history to young people today, because I didn't see the importance of it. I didn't see the significance of it. As Amelia says, I taught her things. She's actually taught me a lot. She's made me realize the significance of Black history in this country. And one of my greatest regrets is that I didn't get more information out of my mother before she passed, because she had an amazing background in itself. So if you're out there, all of you young people, go to your grandma. You know, I'm a grandmother. I have this amazing 20-year-old granddaughter who blows me away. But she asks me about my history. My daughter asks me about my history, and my son does too. So go out there, go to your grandma, go to your aunt, go to your uncle, go to every Black elder you know, and get information. Write it down. Tape it. You don't even have to bother to write it down. Tape it. Just get to know their backgrounds. And they'll surprise you, because, you know, we did really interesting things. God knows how we did it, but we did. You know, like I went to the 6th Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam in 1974. And of the 3 members of the BLF that went, 2 of us were women. You know, Gerlin and myself. We went. And that was an experience in itself. We met people like Herbert Chitepo before he was killed, you know, who was leader of ZANU. We met Marcelinos dos Santos from Frelimo. We met all the liberation movements. And we had letters of introduction from my then partner and late husband. We had letters of introduction because he was a member of the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO. So we met these amazing people. Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, poured us tea. We still haven't gotten over it to this day, you know, being given tea by Julius Nyerere, you know. And then the crowning moment of my life, and I've told Amelia this, and to this day, the crowning moment of my life was when a Palestinian frog marched up the aisle of the Congress auditorium and presented arms to Julius Nyerere, because the it was the OAU then, the Organization of African Union, recognized the PLO as a liberation struggle. See, that's how internationalist Africa was. You know, and the Caribbean, by the way. We had progressive leaders in the Caribbean too. So if you remember those days, those were exciting times. So it wasn't just, I don't know, we didn't feel as though we were sacrificing anything. Quite the reverse. It was a very exciting life at that period in history.
So I think this is a really good moment to just prompt the people watching and say that we're going to jump into a Q&A soon. So if you do have questions that you want to ask, this is the time, this is a perfect opportunity, and leave it in the comments. But sort of a last one for me, and the thing that I found really interesting hearing you both speak, and particularly Zainab, what you were saying about being the first and saying, I was the first to do this, do we know about it? And also just looking at this shift in history and what sort of new organizers, new Black radical women doing this work now, the knowledge that they have. And I know that I have personally found a lot of political awakening in organizing and communing with collectives of Black women or women of color specifically. And often what would come up in that work is the work being lauded for being the first. The first person who's done this, the first Black woman to photograph this thing or be on the cover of that or open this type of shop or whatever it was. And then I started looking back at history, and actually I was like, this has been happening. Black people have consistently been doing stuff. Like, of course we have. We've been here. And I really want to get your opinions on if the as you mentioned before, Zainab, your approach to the work was, you know, we are united in this struggle, whereas I know that my personal approach to similar work was much more, we are united by our race. If you think that those things play a role in how we document the stories from the past, if the kind of organizing that you were doing, Zainab, can still be achieved in the same way today as it was back then, and as a final sort of roundup of those thoughts, how you would recommend to younger people organizing now to make sure that their histories get retold by 20, 40, 60 years down the line, generations doing the same thing then. So that was a big question. It was 3 in 1. Maybe Amelia, if you want to start first on your thoughts.
I've kind of got lost in the question.
Okay, so we'll break it down into the 3 questions it was. The first one is, do you think that the over focus on race nowadays and being the first and being the one Black person to do X, Y, Z might be hindering the way that we approach these histories and these past histories and make sure these histories get known? So that was the first question. And then the second question that we'll look at is how do we prevent or make sure that for generations in the future, that the work that is being done now doesn't get lost and still gets retold, and what your thoughts are on that?
Okay. Well, I think the first question around this kind of shift in Black politics to maybe race first or neglecting other aspects, I think that we have to look at like the political context of the time that we're living in, and it's so much different to how it was in the 1970s or 80s. For one thing, I think that class consciousness or socialist politics has been so watered down by this era of neoliberalism that we're living in, and of course the absence of any kind of model of communism, like the Soviet Union, for example, doesn't exist anymore. So we're living without something to aspire to in terms of a socialist world, which impacts how we think about the nature of class and capitalism today in our activisms. In terms of, did that answer the first question?
Yeah, I think that was a good answer.
Okay. In terms of the second question, I think that, wait, sorry, remind me of the second question.
So the second question is, for generations that come up in the future and are doing the same kind of work, what is your suggestion of making sure that histories don't get lost and we're not just repeating the cycle of we're the first, when actually this work has been consistently done by generations in this country?
I think that it has to do with being the recorders of our own history. So even in the era of the Black women's movement, so much was going on in terms of making sure there was a records of meetings taking place. The book, The Heart of the Race, has gone a long way to document that period of activism, and is so integral because it's actually written by the participants in that particular era as well. So being the writers and documenters of our own history is really important, and making sure that we are keeping a record, whether it's minutes of a meeting, a photograph of an event that's happened, a recording of an event like we're doing at the moment, and just making sure that our children, our grandchildren are also given the privilege of being told about our experiences. I know for my grandmother was actually really shocked that I would be interested in her experiences in Britain in the 60s and 70s, and she was kind of suspicious, like, why are you asking me these questions? But it's because it's just so important to know what's happened to us in the past, to know where we're going as a community. So yeah, I think making sure that we are documenting what we're doing as we're doing it, which is kind of hard to do when you're in the moment, but it's really vital.
Brilliant. And Zainab, those same questions to you.
Okay, start me off again. Okay.
So the first question is just, do you think that the difference in a sort of race forward approach now in terms of organizing has an effect on how histories from the past that were more focused on overcoming a specific and shared struggle has played a role in how those histories are remembered? Because nowadays there's very much focus on being the first Black person, being this person who's done this. Sometimes it's a very loaded question, to be fair.
I think what's important about history is that you've got to put it in the context of its time.
Yeah.
And in our time, my time, there was a whole international struggle of liberation. There was the independence movements in Africa, there was the liberation movements in Southern Africa, there was the Pan-African movement, there was the non-aligned movement, there was the Cuban Revolution to look up to. And by the way, I still look up to the Cuban Revolution today, which to me is amazing. Those people are amazing, that they've survived this long, constantly pilloried by the United States and all of its allies, and still they do achieve amazing things. And Black people there have an equality of life that they rarely have anywhere else, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. So you've got to put history in the context of its time and deal, activism in the context of its time. And as I said, in my time, there was the Vietnam War. There was actually things like the student movement in France. Do you remember, that there was nearly a takeover in France. There was nearly a second revolution in France. So there was this whole atmosphere. When I said it wasn't about the Black movement for me, it wasn't about color for me, I didn't mean that we weren't dealing with color, because we were. That was our big problem here, was mass discrimination. But what I meant to say, it wasn't the way we wanted to see the world. We fought for a revolution. There's no other way of saying it. I mean, I can't be nice about it and say we weren't anti-capitalist. We were very anti-capitalist. I'm still anti-capitalism. How does capitalism help anybody? It's a selfish system which, enriches a tiny minority and leaves the mass of the people, white and Black, impoverished. But the point is, think of your time and approach your history in that way. Forget about being first. First is irrelevant. Right? I found out through a friend of mine, Dr. Hakim Adi, Professor Adi. He told me something that I never knew before, because I've always been an admirer of the Chartist movement. Do you remember the Chartist movement? It was a historical movement of workers demanding rights, basic human rights, the right to vote, the right for wages, it was getting out of serfdom, basically. And one of the Chartists was an African. This totally blew me away. Totally, I mean, we were here back then in the forefront of struggle, even then. I think, when was the Chartist movement, Amelia? Was it 1700 or something? I can't remember when it was, or 1800. But
yeah, I think 1800s.
Yeah, and that blew me away, that, an African brother saw that he had more association and more in common with the white working class than he did with a Black upper class, if there was one, And the same as my time. It was like that at my time. Like, for instance, I remember when we had the Brixton Black Women's Group, when some of the sisters came along and said, we want to discuss wages for housework. Now, that to me was totally out of line, totally out of line. That was a very white middle class concept. We were being asked to consider a very white middle class concept in a Black women's movement, when our people were doing 3 or 4 jobs. Our parents were doing 2, 3 jobs, you know, just to keep body and soul together. So wages for housework didn't cut it for me, not at all. And as I said, I had more in common with white working class women than I did with Black women who had this bourgeois approach to feminism. So when I say it's not about color, it was about color, but there are other things besides.
Yeah, and I think the soundbite that you said, actually, of think of your time, is a really useful one to go by and to take forward. And just to follow on from that quickly before we go on to the questions, because I want to make sure that we've got time to get through all of them, is to just follow on from that, and what would you suggest to the generations of the future to make sure that actually these histories get remembered and we don't keep going through the cycles of forgetting and relearning and forgetting? How do we make sure that this history stays getting told?
Support the Black Cultural Archive. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect. I know it's not. But have an archive of Black history. You know, the young historians, I'm amazed by them. They blow me away. They blow me away. Because the whole concept of having young people writing, you know, being, how do you call, guardians of our history is wonderful. So support that. Be a part of that. As I said, ask your family about their histories. They'll tell you to go away, not to bother. Oh, it's irrelevant, like I did at first to my children. But be persistent, you know. Stand up and be counted, and be counted. Life isn't about going and earning a living and buying. How many cars can you drive? How many houses can you have? You know, how many holidays can you take? Forget that. Life isn't about that. Life is making the future better. You know, and we can see that with climate change. So it's not about accumulation, and it's not about consumption. It's about making the world a better place. And at the moment, we're not doing that.
Well, I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and also a very strong and powerful reminder. So thank you. That's been a really nice way to finish off on my questions. I'm really excited to ask some of the questions that have come in from the audience. There's quite a few. So if we could try and keep our answers brief, because I just want to make sure that everyone gets their question heard. So we'll start with this question from T. And Zainab, I imagine this is directed to you, but Amelia, jump in if you feel like you have something to add to it. Says, you mentioned that the British Black Panthers were inspired by the US version. Did they have any contact with each other?
I didn't say the British Black Panthers. I said the Black movement, you know, as it were. Because Panthers, you had the London Panthers, you had the Birmingham Panthers, you had Panthers in Leeds. You had the Black Liberation Front. Do you know what I mean? The BLF was part of the International Panther Network. Okay, so we were associated with the Black Panther Party USA. All right, so we had lots of contact. Even I don't know whether you remember Gil Scott-Heron, who was a musician. He had a song, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." Well, Gil Scott-Heron came to us in the BLF from the Black Panther Party in New York. And he wanted Black people to attend his conference in London. He was having a concert in London, and no Black people were coming, and blah, blah, blah. And he just wanted Black people to attend. Well, the price of the concert was big money. And I said to him, you know, no chance, you know, Black people don't earn enough to come to your concert. It's like a week's wage. So what he did was he gave us a great pile of tickets, and we handed out the tickets to Black people down the Grove and in Brixton. to attend his concert, and he loved that. He loved that, and that was, you know, that kind of solidarity stuff was happening all the time. I interviewed Stokely Carmichael in Washington, D.C., in his place in Washington, D.C., and we became friends. And he influenced me a lot. His Pan-Africanism. He said, now I'm paraphrasing, the highest state of Black power is Pan-Africanism. You know, and that's so true. You know, we were fortunate enough to have leaders like Malcolm X, you know, not that idiot Michael X. I'm talking about Malcolm X. And Malcolm was amazing. He grew in public. He grew in front of us, you know, from a crazy pimp to this amazing, amazing brother who had the words and the ability to communicate to Black people all over the world. So go out there, join the struggle, because it's still there. You know, don't be comfortable. Being comfortable is boring. Go out there and be part of the struggle.
So this next question is for Amelia, and it asks, as a historian, how do you / have you navigated the deliberate erasure of Black women from historical narratives about liberation struggles in Britain?
I guess the greatest, the most valuable method that I've used and that I've come across is oral history, especially in making sure that women who have not been written about or sufficiently written about get their chance to speak about their own experiences in their own words. So oral history, not only for me, but I think for a lot of historians who deal with this contemporary era of Black activism, the fact that a lot of participants in this movement are still around and available and willing to talk about their experiences is something that we need to take advantage of as much as possible. So I definitely do. I mean, I'm always trying to interview. I don't know how many times I've interviewed Zainab. She's just one person. So yeah, it's really important to not only interview our elders, but also make sure that we're forging trusting relationships with them, because it's not just the fact that you're a historian and you're charged with writing this massive piece of history, but it's also a collaborative effort in that it's your words, but it's also the material from other people's lives that makes it a whole narrative. So keeping that in mind as well, the fact that it's not just a fun project, it's also you're dealing with someone's lived experiences. So yeah, oral history is valuable in more ways than one.
Definitely. I think that's a really important thing to note about being aware of the fact that as much as documenting this history is important, you are dealing with real things. You're dealing with real people and real lives and real histories. And that always has to be approached with sensitivity. So thank you for that answer, Amelia. This next question is from Lacuna Magazine. It's for Zainab. Says, did you work with people like Buchi Emecheta? I know she was a novelist and academic, but I wondered if she was involved in any of the Black liberation movements.
I don't recall the name, but that doesn't mean to say that she wasn't part of the movement. I just don't recall the name. You know, the older you get, the more our memory goes. You know, there's a lot of people whose names, whose faces I remember, whose names I don't, you know. So, no, I don't recall that name, and I don't recall her as an academic either, because we didn't have many academics around in my day. You know, there was very few. So, no, I'm sorry, I don't recall her. Please tell me about her.
So Buchi Emecheta was a writer, and I know that particularly in the work that I used to do with Wasafiri, a lot of the writers of the time, the Buchi Emecheta's name was brought up a lot. So I think that's definitely an interesting thing for another panel to explore, is actually as much as there was many different liberation movements, there was also many different creative and cultural movements going on all across London, all across the UK at the same
Exactly.
time. And making those links is really interesting. So not something we can cover today, but listen, I think bank that question. Definitely something to be explored on a different
Please
panel.
tell me about us. Send me information.
Okay, this one is from T. Says, as we see increasing problems in the UK and across the world in terms of capitalism, causing poverty, inequality, war, etc., do you think there will be a similar kind of movement again? And would you join?
I'd definitely join if there was an anti-capitalist movement. Absolutely. Capitalism, seriously. I mean, I think there was a recent survey. Now, don't quote me on this, but I read it in like the Washington Post or something like that. There was a survey in the United States among young people under the age of 25. And a good 50-odd% of them were anti-capitalist. Now, doesn't that tell you something? Capitalism doesn't serve the mass of the people. It really doesn't. The billionaires, to be a billionaire is an obscenity. No one should be a billionaire. Why? Tell me why anyone deserves to be a billionaire. If someone can go out there and justify it to me, then okay. But I just don't accept anybody should be a billionaire. Nobody should be a billionaire. Even a millionaire, it's kind of doubtful. But, you know, with value of property and things like that, that's changed. But a billionaire, no. And capitalism doesn't create equal opportunity. It never has, and it never will. The lack of the misuse of talent, the ignorant way it deals with the working class in this country, it deliberately creates a system which suppresses ability. So why would I be pro-capitalist? No, Tim. No, I would join any anti-capitalist movement. Absolutely, if I had the energy. The older I get, the worse it becomes. You know?
Brilliant. And we've got another question from you from Lacuna magazine, which says, Zainab, what is your view of the white feminist groups at the time? Were they supportive of your work? Was it ever important or necessary to build relations with them?
It might have been important for some people. It wasn't for me. I'd seen white feminism in Birmingham. Wasn't impressed by it. Very intellectual, very much following the American example, and very little to do with the working women, white working women. So the feminist movement, the white feminist movement didn't appeal to me at all. And that's why one of the reasons I was very against discussing Selma James's, I call it nonsense, about wages for housework. Well, I don't care what people think of me when I say it was nonsense. For me, it was nonsense, you know. And, you know, it didn't apply to my community. It didn't apply to my revolutionary principles. It didn't apply to the Black community or the Asian community or anything like that. It just didn't apply. So you know, that was just one of those typical white middle class debates, you know. When we get the revolution, maybe we'll talk about wages for housework. But until the revolution happens, no, I don't want to discuss wages for housework.
And could you just touch on just slightly the last part of that question, was which is just on, was it ever important or necessary to build relations with them, with the white feminist groups?
You have relationships with lots of people, you know. And for instance, I remember the IRA coming to one of our demonstrations, the Irish Republican Army. Not the army itself, but, you know, representatives of the IRA came to one of our demonstrations. So we had relationships with all kinds of people. I suppose if there were revolutionary feminists out there, we would have had relations with them, but I don't recall anyone that we had a strong relationship in the white feminist movement. You know, we had our own movement. And the sisters, you know, Black women were talking their own truths and dealing with our own issues. So, no.
Well,
Sorry.
that was I don't think you have to apologize at all. I think that was a really interesting question and an even more illustrative answer. So thank you for asking that, Lacuna Magazine. This one is from AfroLit. Says, a question to Miss Zainab Abbas. Thank you so much for sharing. As an internationalist, were you in contact with other Black women and groups in continental Europe?
That's interesting, because we were in contact with other Black women and groups in, for instance, Australia, because the Indigenous community in Australia had their own Black Panther Party. So, so as far as away as Australia, Africa, the Middle East, the Americas, Brazil, you know, South America as well as Northern America, American Indian movement, you know, etc. But I don't recall, and this is a bit naughty, but I don't recall any Black sisters groups or other groups that we were in contact with in Europe. What we were part of, you know, there was this struggle for liberation in Algeria and the FLN, you know, and the Front National Liberation. And so we were supportive of groups like the FLN in Paris or in France. But no, I don't recall that. You know, we were in touch with so many people, and there was so much going on. It's very difficult to remember every single
players everywhere, yeah,
group that we were part of.
Yeah, and I'd just like to jump off on that before we wrap up, and ask the same thing to you, Amida, actually, is that do you have any connections with Black historians, groups in Europe or other countries that you're in contact with in your own work as a historian?
I'm afraid I don't, and I need to work on that. I think that's a question that's going to take me into some networks and see what can be done about that, because that's an important thing.
Well, I mean,
No,
go on, finish. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say it's important to be in touch with people who are in different geographical locations. So, but I'm not at the moment.
But I also think the work that both of you are doing to highlight what is going on in Britain, in this country, you know, I think we get so much information about what goes on in America, what goes on in continental Africa. There is a wealth of information that we need to be sharing about what goes on in Britain. It's a very small island. The UK is a very small country. There is so much to learn about the populations here. And I appreciate the work that both of you have been doing and are going to continue to do. And I think this is a great place to wrap up. So as any final last words, it would be great if, let's start with Amelia, if you can share where people can follow your work and where they can find you, if there's anything you'd like to let the audience know about, now is your time.
Okay, sure. Well, if you're interested in seeing anything that I've written, my publishing name is A.S. Francis. I work with the Young Historians Project, as I mentioned, and also History Matters. There's various groups called History Matters. There's one that's quite a dubious organisation. It's a conservative think tank, so please don't think that I'm referring to that History Matters. The History Matters that I'm referring to is currently working on a conference called The New Perspectives on the History of African and Caribbean people in Britain. So if you're interested in hearing some informative presentations around those histories, please look us up. We also produce a journal, a History Matters journal it's called, which is completely free to access, and it's digital as well. And we encourage people of any background, any kind of educational background to contribute writings if you're doing new and exciting research about African and Caribbean people and the histories of these communities in Britain.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you. And Zainab, the same to you. Where can people follow what you do? If there's anything you want to share, now's your time.
I'm not on social media. I'm a paranoid 60s chick, right? And when we were paranoid in the 60s, everyone said we were crazy. Well, that's all proved to be true. You know, that the FBI were following us everywhere. The special branch here and MI5 were following us and infiltrating us. So I'm a paranoid 60s chick, and I don't believe in social media. It really bugs me. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, they can contact A.S Francis, who I adore. I think she's the most amazing young sister ever, and someone I laud, because, you know, these young people, what they're doing is incredible. But Amelia's out there.
Blush.
I don't care. You can blush away. You deserve it, and you deserve the credit for it. And please keep doing it, Amelia, on behalf of all of us. And then
I strongly agree.
Can I just say something? I saw a thing out there where someone said, Zainab at 71, ready to join an anti-capitalist movement, just makes me so happy. Well, I'm glad, Pauline. I'm glad, because I want you to get to 71 and still be ready to join an anti-capitalist movement.
Too right. And thank you both. It's been a really, really interesting discussion for me and the audience. I hope it was equally as interesting for you. I've been Varizo. You can find me at varizo.com or at Practical Myth on social media. And I just want to highlight again that you can get 25% off if you use the discount code. Is it Claudia Launch Event? It was on the screen. There we go. Claudia Launch Event for 25% off at lwbooks.co.uk. And please check out the rest of the Radical Black Women series at the Black Cultural Archives, which you can also donate to bcajustgiving.com. Look at that. Beautiful. So that's all for this evening. Thank you both once again. And thank you to the audience.
To you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.